So, as you might have gathered, this was originally Andrew Connell's session. Obviously, he can't be here. I think he would have done a better job of delivering this presentation than I would, even in the best case. But I only found out about this, 24 hours ago that I was going to be delivering this. So, I think if I'd have had more time, I would have liked to have done some demos that maybe AC wasn't going to do. But I think that you will sort of get a good sense of the changes for web content management. And I think this is a slightly weird presentation. Some of it is aimed at developers, and some of it is aimed at, particularly non-technical people. So I think if we've got a mix of people here, I think you'll probably get something out of it, regardless of where you come from. The information in the slides is kind of developer-oriented. The information in the demos, anybody can get to see sort of the changes for content authors, people that are implementing the sites and how things change there. Okay, so you might have seen me talk before. So I'm Chris O'Brien, a SharePoint MVP. That's my blog and Twitter alias. So in terms of who AC thinks it's aimed at, I think the idea is that you are familiar perhaps with some elements of 2010 WCM. More so 2007. So if you had any familiarity with building web content management sites in 2007, then I think this is kind of the logical progression of that information. So whether you're a designer or a developer or you're involved in the implementation of WCM sites somehow, then this is really aimed at you. Now, the presentation is kind of split into what's improved, so what was in 2007 WCM but is better, and then also what is kind of brand new in 2010. It's a slightly weird breakdown, as we'll see as we work through some of the areas, but I think if you're coming from 2007, then it should hopefully make sense. So first thing we'll look at is some of the platform improvements, so things that aren't specific to WCM. And we look at kind of how data changes, how accessibility changes, and things that are different for developers. And then we'll take a look at what's improved, so some functionality that was there in 2007, but is better. And then we'll look at the brand new stuff that Microsoft are introducing for web content management sites in this release. Okay, so thinking about platform things then, things that have changed probably as SharePoint overall that isn't really tied to WCM. So you might know that there was a big push in this release to get cleaner markup. The feedback that Microsoft got for 2007 was pretty bad. A lot of people that are used to developing public-facing websites weren't really happy with the HTML that was produced by SharePoint. Microsoft listened to that feedback. I don't think the output is absolutely perfect in this release, but I think the effort that you have to spend, perhaps as a development team, to get the output to be what you want it to be is a lot less. So there is a big improvement. As well as the markup improvements, some of the things that I'm particularly pleased about as a developer is things like the JavaScript and CSS is completely refactored. So you might be used to, if you're a developer, you might be used to core.css and core.js, very big files which get downloaded to each of the end users. Those are substantially refactored, so users really only get what they need, which means that pages load faster, the page weights are smaller, and it's a much kind of slicker site. In addition, the JavaScript files are crunched in Microsoft terms. The industry term, I think, is minified, really, and it's really where all the white space is removed from the file to make it smaller and make it, again, quicker to send down the pipe to the client. We've got a minimal master page that comes out of the box. You might find that as a really good starting point as a dev to build your WCM site. There are others now available through the community, but I think what we've got in the box for a minimal starting point is a lot better than what we ever had. Obviously, we've got the ribbon, so content authors are now using the ribbon. And when we take a look at the demo, what you see is that the rich text editor, which was kind of in line in the past, if you're editing a certain placeholder in the page, it would appear where you're editing. Now it's integrated with the ribbon. And I think that's going to help end users because they're getting more and more used to the ribbon in other areas of SharePoint, for one, but also with the Office products on the desktop. So it's kind of fallen in line with how users work with products there. And of course, as technology moves on, web experiences get slicker, so there's a lot more Ajax in SharePoint and far fewer postbacks, and I think authors will just kind of be able to move through their tasks a lot quicker. So thinking about the accessibility for a minute, Microsoft's target was AA, that's WCAG AA. It's unclear at the moment until we get the RTM bits whether they absolutely hit it. The last I heard is that they weren't going to be far off AA. So if you're having to build a AA compliant website for a client, I think you'll have some work still to do. But in comparison to the work that you had to do in 2007, it will be much reduced. So I think we've moved forward quite a lot there. The output is XHTML strict, which is interesting. I think we all thought they were going to go for XHTML transitional, but they've kind of took it as far as they can in terms of XHTML compliance, and all the DTDs for the master pages and so on are strict. And really what they've done is taken out most of the tables that was in the really bad markup that 2007 produced. So things like navigation, there's an easy option now to get navigation that isn't rendered as HTML tables. The rich text editor is much improved. They've kind of upped the game on what they used to class as down-level browsers. So Firefox, for example, is now a level 1 browser. You've got full author support. So if you've got a mixed browser community, either it's an internet site where you've got some kind of distributed authoring, or inside your firewall, people are using Firefox to author, they'll get as good an experience as the IE users. And that wasn't the case in 2007. Also, there is an XHTML markup kind of parser in the rich text editor. So if your content authors are putting things in placeholders, they're putting HTML content in and they've got perhaps the permissions to edit the HTML directly, they can press that button, and that means that as well as the surrounding template areas being valid XHTML, their content kind of gets made into valid XHTML. And that's always the challenge with accessible pages, that, okay, you can do all the work to make the template accessible, and then your content authors can potentially put in junk that will mean it will fail validation. So that's what that button's for. Okay, so thinking about the markup a little bit more, in terms of the out-of-the-box controls, we see that the output for specific controls is much better and cleaner than before. So there is something to think about here, that if you've got these custom controls in your existing page layouts and master pages, if you've developed specific CSS around the output here, because the base HTML has changed, you might have to revisit that CSS. So as you're upgrading your 2007 sites, there will be an exercise of kind of validating all your CSS work and making sure that it's still valid. I think that there will be some tweaks that you have to make there, in addition to doing things like putting the ribbon HTML in the master page. So consider for a minute the output from the old navigation control. What you see is that it's using HTML tables. This was a bad thing because it isn't tabular data. The accessibility guidelines say that HTML tables should, for the most part, be used for tabular data. Navigation doesn't fit into that category. The new markup, you have to set a particular mode on the control to get this, is with divs and unordered lists and list items. Now, most people that are building 2007 WCM sites wrote their own navigation control because they needed to get that output. This output is something that will work very well in a screen reader. It's kind of much cleaner. And now it's kind of good news that we've got that out of the box. So this is one of many things that developers don't have to spend time on when building 2010 WCM sites. Thinking about the tooling for devs, Designer is obviously much improved. I saw a few comments to say that they've seen lots of presenters using it and it hadn't crashed once this week, whereas for 2007 it probably would have crashed, you know, a couple of times per presenter. And there's a lot more that you can do with it. So it is a much better tool, and I think that we'll all use it much more for building WCM sites. You've hopefully seen some of the Visual Studio improvements for developers. And I think one of the key things there is that the extensibility that Microsoft brought in will make it easier for the community to extend, and that will make developers' lives even more easier. So the big kind of thing out there at the moment is the CKS Dev Toolkit, which a few of the guys here have worked on. And that's going to make your lives easier by adding kind of new explorers in. You can do things like pick a specific content type and then easily get a layout bound to that. You can do a quick deploy, which will copy your files directly to the SharePoint route and really just make the developer experience a lot slicker. Again, more dev stuff, so thinking about how data works. You've probably seen some of this stuff in other sessions, but this is one of the big platform investments that Microsoft made in this release. So we've got linked to SharePoint, which means that you have less need to write camel code and camel queries. Something that AC wouldn't have known about when he wrote this slide deck is that linked to SharePoint cannot be used with anonymous users. So that's kind of something you need to be aware of. And if you're building public-facing anonymous sites, you probably still need to write camel queries. Best I know, that information kind of only came out this week, basically, from some testing that Waldeck was doing. And on the internal mailing list, I saw some product team staff confirm that. You've seen the client object model, hopefully, and that's really going to be useful for building kind of, I hate to use the Web 2.0 term, but really in terms of building really good user experiences where you're not doing postbacks so often. I think that's the thing that you're going to leverage to be able to build kind of partial postback pages, so Ajax-like pages, jQuery-like pages. That's what you're going to use to communicate with the server, and you can build lots of great websites with that. In terms of other non-SharePoint data, obviously we can use BCS to connect to other things, custom SQL stores, Oracle stores, web services, and if you've not really looked at BCS, the other great thing about it is that if your data source doesn't happen to be one of those things, you can just write some code. It's called a BCS shim, effectively, which can kind of translate and talk to the thing that you want. And you can basically expose anything you like through BCS now. So that's a good way to easily bring data into your website. The main benefit of doing it the BCS way is that you can get the search to find it. So if you've got some products or customer databases, you can get them to appear in SharePoint search results, and publish that externally if that's the kind of website you're building, pretty easily in comparison to the custom dev work you would have had to do otherwise. And same for external lists. That's really about being able to use SQL to store the data, perhaps because you want to do something else with it in SQL, build some foreign key relationships that are kind of difficult to model in SharePoint lists. As far as the user is concerned, or the content author, it's just a regular SharePoint list to them, but in the background it's stored completely somewhere different in SQL. Okay, so those are the platform improvements. That's kind of not specific to WCM. That's really stuff that is a benefit whatever we're doing with SharePoint. Let's kind of look at what's improved then with content management sites in SharePoint 2010. So main areas are things like content authoring. I think the client that I'm working with now, I think their guys would be really impressed with the slickness of content authoring compared to what they've got now. I know like some of the comments that they come to me with are, there's a few too many clicks in a couple of places. Sometimes the thing that appears when we're adding an image isn't the most useful thing, and we have to change the view in the picker, and that helps us find the image that we're looking for. I think some of those things are what Microsoft tried to target in this release. So my expectation is that content authors are going to find it a lot easier to work with. We've got some infrastructure improvements that help us build larger WCM sites. We'll take a look at what's changed there. Content query web part, which is something that a lot of people use in WCM sites. Obviously, it's a web part, so if you're building an accessible site, you tend to need to do some extra work to make the web part itself compliant in terms of HTML. But it's a great control for rolling up lots of data to landing pages and doing navigation and providing links to other areas. They've made some improvements there that, again, mean that devs have to do less work to leverage that stuff. Multilingual is improved. Spence did a really good session yesterday on that. And it's really about improvements to the robustness of it. And the same in content deployment. So if you ever had clients where you had fairly large WCM sites, if you were doing some of the multilingual stuff or content deployment, both of those were flaky. That's the best way to think about it. And what Microsoft have tried to do is remove the flake factor. Okay, so those are some of the improvements that we're going to take a look at. After that, we'll take a look at sort of brand new stuff that is completely new in this release. Okay, so diving into the what's improved then. So we talked about the authoring experience. This is one of the things that I'm going to demo. We've got the ribbon in there, that makes it slicker. We've got what Microsoft are calling one-click page authoring. I notice AC calls it one click plus one. I think I know what he means there. There is an extra click to actually get the page published. But again, it's all about making the lives easier for content authors. HTML editor, as we say, is cross-browser. It's integrated with the ribbon rather than in place in the kind of rich text editor box itself. The main thing to think about with this is that if you are used to building WCM sites, often you might have gone for a third-party product called Telerik. That's probably the market leader in terms of replacing the Moss rich text editor. And I think you don't need to do that in 2010. So Microsoft have tried to take all the reasons that you might have needed to buy Telerik and bolt it onto Moss, and they've tried to build that into their own out-of-the-box control. So to get kind of cross-browser capability, because the Moss one didn't work very well with Firefox. They've sorted that, and they've sorted out the output so that the output that this control generates is all XHTML. In terms of finding images and other assets within your site, they've made a kind of a new picker control, which gives you a bit of a richer view as you're trying to find the image that you're looking for. And I know from the client that I'm working with right now, I think that's the kind of thing that will make content authors like the system. It's now possible to embed video directly into a normal placeholder. You don't need a special field control or web part on the page to do this. Doesn't mean that any web author can put any video on anywhere on the page. It's subject to permissions and controls on that particular placeholder. But it does mean that you don't need a special zone on the page. The video can be embedded anywhere you want, if that's what you choose to allow. We'll take a look at that as well. Okay, so that's content authoring. Thinking about infrastructure changes, in Moss, obviously the pages library was just one library. We had the guideline of 2,000 items in any one container in SharePoint. And you couldn't put folders in pages libraries. You can now. So you can kind of nest folders and go down as deep as you like in one pages library rather than having to create a subweb for pages lower down. Now that's going to enable you to obviously put more web pages in one place, and if you're building very large kind of content sites with 40,000 pages, you're probably going to make use of that. There's a feature called Content Organizer, which isn't WCM specific, but I think AC is on the right lines that you might choose to use that if you're doing folders in pages libraries. So this will enable you to upload or create a page in a pages library, and then if you assign metadata to it, if you say that this page color is blue, then that can route automatically into the blue subfolder wherever it is in that pages library structure. So if you've got really big sites with lots and lots of pages, that's probably the thing that's going to make your content authors' lives easier in terms of getting the page into the right place. So rather than having to navigate down lots of folders, you can just set up a rule to say, put it in there if X equals Y. And there's also an automatic check for unpublished items. So that's something that in Moss, authors had to do to make sure that they didn't have any broken links effectively when they published the page. I never came across an author that ever remembered to do it. So now it happens automatically when the page is saved. Okay, so content query web part, I think useful, regardless of what kind of site you're building, because if you're building an AA site, a compliant site, it can still be used as long as you deal with the web part zone and so on. And they've made it easier to use in terms of developers. So before there was a real pain in the neck, to be honest, where often you were using custom fields and you're using the content query web part to read those fields. Instead of just being able to specify what fields you want in the query that gets executed, you had to export the XML, faff around with the XML on the file system in Notepad or Visual Studio, upload it to the web part gallery, and then make use of that. And it was kind of stupid that you had to do it, really. So they solved that problem. So now there's just a property on the web part where you can enter the fields that you want to use. There's also a concept called slots, which is really about minimizing the need to customize the XSL. So they've tried to genericize the XSL that gets used into kind of generic things like title, body, and you can say exactly what field that maps to in your content type. Okay, so the other infrastructure improvements in terms of removing the flakiness with these areas. So both of these have moved to, well, particularly with variations, that was kind of a synchronous process that was executing in W3WP. Now it's moved to a timer job, which has more robustness. You know, if something fails, then it will retry. And really, it does make it easier to build sites with variations. So variations, if you haven't used this functionality, this is the framework in SharePoint that allows you to kind of define your translations, basically. And whenever you create a page, a mirrored page will be created automatically in the other language. So that's now a timer job that's running that process. In terms of content deployment, larger customers would run into problems where you'd run into some locking problems because authors are creating new pages on the site at the same time that you're perhaps doing a deployment from authoring to production. What happens now in the background is quite clever. I think it relies on something in SQL that was added in one of the service packs in 2005, but it was in there in 2008, where at the SQL level, it creates a snapshot of the database when you start a content deployment job. What happens here is the content deployment job runs off the snapshot instead of the live data. So your authors can continue creating pages and all this database locking problem won't happen. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these improvements then. So over in my VM, now if you came to any of other my talks, this is the site that I've been using as a test bed for various things. Let me refresh that. Okay, cool. So let's look at the process for creating a page then as a content author. So go to the ribbon and new page. And do you notice something different about this? That what's happening here is all I've got to do is specify the name. I'm not being asked for the page layout that I want to use. So we're trying to streamline the authoring experience. Now, if you're thinking that through, there is an interesting thing about how does it know what page layout to use? So there's kind of a trade-off somewhere. It can't read the author's mind, obviously. So let's call this Evo demo. I need to come out of the Zoom. So it doesn't choose the layout at random, but it's also not asking the author which layout to use. I think it's defaulting to, I'm not sure if you can set it explicitly. It might default to one of the generic out-of-the-box layouts. What happens is you can then come up to the ribbon if it didn't use the layout that you wanted, and you can use this page layout button up here and just select the layout dynamically. So I could say it's the destinations guide page that I wanted. Oh, that's got a Bing map on, so that's erroring because we haven't got wireless connectivity in here. But that just changed the layout on the fly here. So authors can kind of create the page with a one-click thing. If they need to use a different layout, then they probably need to change it in there. One of the things that's kind of useful is that if the layouts have the same fields because they're using the same content types, then it's almost like they can create the page with any layout and enter the data and then just switch the actual formatting of it anytime they like. So I think it is a bit slicker. If I enter content here, so I'm just going to type some sentence that's a bit small at the back. What you notice, of course, is that there is no control here. Everything is up in the ribbon now, so that's that change. The other thing I like about the ribbon, and I think that authors are going to like, is that we've got some kind of dynamic Ajax-y kind of update. So I don't have to make the change, see what it looks like, save the page, preview it, anything like that. I can just hover over the option and it will dynamically adjust. So again, more improvements for content authors that should hopefully make their lives a bit easier. We've got this button up here, which is the convert to XHTML button. So that's the thing that authors can press if they need the output to be XHTML compliant. I dare say that if you are a developer, you could hook into what's happening there to make it happen automatically on page save. I don't think that should be too complex. And other things, so if we go to the Insert tab up here, if we go to Insert an image, with me one sec. There we go. There is a bug in the RC and the beta that if your site isn't in the local internet zone, which mine isn't, you get security prompts in the pickers, but that's just a pre-release bug. Okay, so if I go to select an image, if I go into my site collection images gallery, say I'm going to drill into country images, see where I've got some files. Okay, so in here, if I hover over one of these, I should get this kind of rich thing that's this Ajax thing. It's a bit like one of those gallery scrollers that you can download off the internet, and it basically gives me all the properties as well as some a way to easily kind of get to the item itself and view the whole thing. So one of the things my client asked me for the other day is we want a specific field on our images library called typically used for. And they were going to enter some kind of words in there about what each image would normally be used for. And that's kind of a great way to surface that information in there so that the content author can easily just hover over the thing and they'll get information like that. So all you'd need to do is add a custom field there to your site collection images library and put some words in it. Okay, so that's picking images. And let's take a look at some of the dev stuff like for content query web part and so on. In fact, if I just put one of these in. So the other thing, so once we've got an image in a placeholder, you see that we've got all this stuff at the top, which again enables me to easily work with the image, and it's kind of all ribbonified, so it's familiar with all the other desktop apps that they might use. Whilst we're in one of these placeholders, so we type some big text. If you look at how reusable content works now, if we go to the Insert tab again, Reusable Content, again we've got the dynamic kind of insertion, so users can see exactly what they're going to get. So it's a lot quicker than an author actually picking something out of the reusable content list and then having to save the page to see it. So again, I think that's the kind of thing that authors are going to like. In terms of some of these rich kind of HTML placeholders, notice that you can also drop a web part into these if you kind of choose to allow that. So this is the new web part picker. If I wanted a content query web part in here, I can actually kind of drop one of those into this, this rich content area. So before we would have needed a specific web part zone in the page layout to enable that, but you can drop it into one of these anytime you like. What happens underneath is some pretty clever runtime processing on the page, which shuffles things around in divs and so on. So I think there is a web part zone that gets added dynamically in the background, but you don't really need to care that as developers or users of the site. It's just going to appear almost like where you dragged and dropped it. Now, there's an issue in this site where I can't show you web part editor panes, which I need to do to show you the content query web part. So I'm going to switch to an out-of-the-box AdventureWorks site. And what we'll do is we'll create a new page here and add a couple of web parts. Oh, I actually edited that page, didn't I? Okay, so if I add a web part into this zone here, okay, so developers will notice that if you've used the content query web part before, some of this stuff down here is new. So these are the slots where you can basically specify which field is the generic thing which is the link, or the generic thing which is the image or the title. So if you've got different content types in use throughout your site, you maybe don't need to customize the XSL as much because we've got this generic slots in the XSL. So again, it's trying to make things like this easier for devs to use and also probably more prevalent in WCM sites. So I think what they're trying to get at is that there's less need to write custom controls. Even with this in MOS 2007, lots of people built kind of custom aggregation controls. I think there's less need to do that now. So somewhere in here is the common view fields, which saves me having to do that trick of saving the XML and re-importing it. So just basically easier to use both for content authors and I think for devs. Okay, so I think those are the improvements. Let's kind of go on in the slides and we'll think about things that are completely new. Before we move off the improvements, actually, we were kind of talking about cleaner markup, accessible sites, and so on. One thing I was hoping to demo that I don't think AC does, but I couldn't get the connectivity sorted out in time, is if you ever use something like YSlow in Firefox to look at why your page might load a bit more slowly, or use Fiddler or Virtual Round Trip Analyzer, one of those tools. Really, you see fairly drastic improvements, I think, the last time I checked. If you compare an out-of-the-box 2007 master page and an out-of-the-box 2010 master page, you see that the page is a lot lighter. They've done a lot of work to kind of combine things into different files. And really, I think when I checked, YSlow reports the out-of-the-box master page is coming out with a C, when I think the MOS 2007 publishing master page used to come out with an F. So that's a rank of A to F. So you can see that they've tried to take in a lot of those best practices for developing fast web pages into 2010. One of the things that they also do, so we talked about things like minifying JavaScript, refactoring all the CSS. They also have a new facility called Script on Demand. So Script on Demand is something that means that all the JavaScript files that are referenced by the page, they only get loaded, they only get downloaded to the client when he clicks on something in the ribbon that needs that JavaScript. I have no idea how they do this, to be honest. I tried to think about how, if I had to implement that, what I would do. I can't really work it out, but it does mean that a user only gets sent the JavaScript that they actually use, which is way better than getting, say, core.js, which was, I think, nearly 80K or something. Interesting thing for developers, you can leverage that with your custom JavaScript files. So there's a kind of a client-side method you can call called register SOD, and you can use that with your custom JavaScript files to make sure that only content authors get those when they click on something in the ribbon, rather than every user, like anonymous users. Okay, so we've covered platform improvements, we've covered what's improved. Let's think about some of the new things. So in this category, AC has some of the more the new out-of-the-box features, and we'll look at things like, I think we've covered the rich content editor. I'm trying to think what else he has. Things like ratings and taggings. The ratings functionality is quite interesting. I know that's something that a lot of people had to write custom code for in 2007. Obviously, that's really a platform feature. It doesn't tie itself to WCM pages. You can now rate any kind of content in 2010. More social stuff, metadata is something that I want to show you. If you're UK-based, you might have seen that I did a presentation a while back on a fairly deep dive, actually, on metadata and taxonomy. And we'll show it in a demo kind of in use for WCM pages and the improvements that content authors have got when tagging their pages. Web analytics have been expanded, so there's some new reports there. Again, if you had to go out and buy a third-party web analytics tool, or you were using Google Analytics, I think there's some new reports in there that might mean that you don't need to do that. One of the big advantages of using out-of-the-box SharePoint analytics is it's more than just page views. So you can kind of aggregate information across search usage and lots of other different types of usage that Google Analytics just cannot see. Okay, so we talked about some of the rich text editor improvements. So we talked about the fact that you don't necessarily need to go out and buy a Telerik kind of control. Ratings, so that's really where we've got the 5 stars, kind of like an Amazon kind of thing. There's a timer job that runs every 15 minutes to aggregate those data. So if you start to use this, you might find that, okay, I've marked that page as a 4. Why have I got no stars showing? And it's because you need to wait for the timer job that's going to average things out, and that runs every 15 minutes. We've got the tagging. We're going to take a look at that in the demo. And the big thing with tagging is, if you've not been to any of the other kind of presentations that talk about metadata, one of the key things here is that you've got two modes, if you like, for the tagging, the new tagging field. You can do things like have a hierarchical list of metadata. That was like a real miss in 2007. You know, practically every client I've ever worked with had some hierarchical keywords list that they wanted to use for tagging. 2007 just didn't have anything, and to be honest, the third-party solutions weren't great either. They've got that in the box, so you can import a big list if you've got one, or just type the entries in. But beyond that, you can allow your content authors to add entries into that as they are tagging pages. So this is known as a folksonomy. And you know, if you choose that some of your fields, you might not do it for all of them, but if you choose that your content authors should be able to add items into the big metadata list, you've got a fairly slick experience for doing that. Talks about the content query web part. Site-based workflows are the idea that a workflow can run on something that isn't a list item or a file. So it's scoped to the site level, and you can have as many of those defined as you want. And I think that's useful for developers. I've often seen dev solutions where you've almost had to invent a list item for a workflow to hang off. This means that you can just run a workflow on the site itself. Silverlight is much more in the box. There's a Silverlight web part that we'll take a quick look at. So if you have content authors that would like to use Silverlight, maybe you have a team in the organization that can create that, then Microsoft have made it easy to use. Okay, so ratings, that's where you can assign the score of 1 to 5 and it gets averaged out. We've talked about taxonomy and folksonomy. It's not foxonomy, which I saw it written on some MVP's blog the other day, which I think is a hierarchy of foxes. Nothing to do with tagging at all. Okay, so we've talked about the Silverlight web part and the site asset library. So the site asset library is the thing that gave us the gallery picker with the Ajax viewer before. Okay, so in terms of the tagging and metadata, again, it's really a platform improvement. It isn't just WCM. It allows you to have a big hierarchical list. What you can also do is define who looks after various bits of the list. So if you've got a big site or a big client with lots of different areas, you can say, you are the term manager for these set of terms. But I don't want you to touch these set of terms because that's not your area of expertise. So you can allow more control, basically, of how pages get tagged. Obviously, the tagging is only one side. You know, you're really going to use that in the search engine or perhaps in the content query web part or some other thing that will aggregate things. But at least the tagging, you know, is much more efficient for authors to use now. If you are tagging files rather than pages, so you've got Word documents, PDF documents that are linked to on your site, for the Office applications like Word and Excel, the authors don't have to tag it in the SharePoint 2010 site. They can tag it in the Backstage view in, say, Word 2010. Does everybody know what Backstage means, or shall I just show it? Put your hands up if you want me to show that. Okay. So if I just fire up Word 2010 quickly. In fact, we might be able to do it in PowerPoint here. Okay, so I haven't got any, this isn't stored in SharePoint, this presentation, so I haven't got anything appearing, but I haven't got Zoom it either. What would happen is that we'd get something here, if you can see the little red dot there. We would get custom fields, so the author doesn't need to do the tagging in the site itself. They would basically be able to do it in the Office app as they are creating the document. And then SharePoint's going to see that when it gets added, and it becomes the SharePoint metadata as well. So it's all very slick, very Microsoft integrated, the kind of things that only Microsoft can really do because it's their product set. And the taxonomy and folksonomy thing, so that's where we can choose whether we want to allow end users to contribute to the keyword list. And there's kind of a lot of management. It's mainly in central admin, in the metadata service application. But you can do lots of things like create synonyms. So if you had, in my company that I'm working for now, they have a particular form, and everybody searches on the intranet for a particular term. I can't remember what it is. And they always get taken something completely irrelevant. Now, what the client needs there is a synonym, so that when somebody is either searching for that thing, the synonym gets used in the search engine. In tagging, you can use the same concept. So when a content author is tagging something with a certain term, if they are effectively mistagging, they shouldn't really be using that. You can make the metadata framework say, no, you're not allowed to use that term, but what I think you really mean is this term. So you've got synonyms on the tagging side and on the search side. Okay, in terms of digital assets, that's obviously something that more of the sites that we build leverage more and more. We've got the ability to embed video in a way that we couldn't before. We needed a special web part. We've got the improvements to the libraries, which enable us to kind of pick the content out a lot better and also store it in a much richer way. Interesting that for images, if you take the image perhaps with one of those cameras that can tag images in the global standard for tagging images, SharePoint is compatible with that. So the metadata against the image can be taken directly from the image whenever it was captured, just using whatever standard they use for that kind of thing. In terms of where your assets live, let's say that we're talking about video, which can be very large files, you've got the option of storing that outside of SharePoint. So if you're on SQL 2008, I think it's R2 that it has to be, you can store those outside of asset libraries or document libraries on the file system. Now, there's some considerations with that, and I know that Mike Watson did a talk here about when RBS does make sense. It can make sense in terms of scalability and performance if it's set up right. There's a few things to think about there. But beyond that, there is also new things in IIS which make streaming better. So you can throttle streaming and do things that you couldn't do before. So if you're working with a client that does do video on their public website, you can configure lots of things in IIS that SharePoint now knows about, which means that your site can't get taken down if one of the videos gets requested heavily during a certain period. It's just that the bit rate will get streamed and controlled a bit more, and that's more likely to keep the site alive. Okay, so in terms of using this media, we've got a Silverlight web part, which means that there's no control to develop to be able to use Silverlight in the site. It's a web part or a field control. It can be specified with a URL if you want to kind of use a Silverlight file that's somewhere else out on the internet, or it can be something. That's something that's native to your site. And you can skin it. So the look and feel probably isn't going to integrate with exactly what you've got, but you can work with that and put some skin on it yourself. Interestingly, it has a JavaScript object model. So you can build your own controls for pausing and skipping forward and skipping back. And obviously you can make those look like whatever you want your site to look like. Web analytics are different. So we've got some new reports. We've got a service application that I was playing around with last night. I couldn't get the thing up and running to show you, unfortunately. But basically, it's more reports that might mean that you're less likely to need a third-party analytics solution. And obviously, what we're saying with the benefit of out-of-the-box analytics is it goes beyond page views. You can do search and things like that. We've got a what's popular web part, and it's basically using the usage analysis function in SharePoint to try and work out what content is being requested the most. Okay, so we'll finish off with a quick demo of some of those things. Okay, so if I've created this site, I've created it in the Scotland area. Let's say that as an author, I want to tag this page. What I've done in the back end is I've created some terms that are related to AdventureWorks. What we'll do as an author is we've kind of added some content to the page. We've done some content authoring. If we go and edit the properties of the page, so this is the familiar properties view that we always had in the back end. Where's my field? I might not be using the right layout. You just go somewhere else. Let's try this page. Okay, so this field at the bottom is the new taxonomy field. It just looks like a fairly regular text box. What we get is the type ahead experience. So if I want to tag this Scotland page as, I think this field is destination features, why would I come to this destination? I can start typing, okay, and then we've got walking that's appeared because that's in our big long list of metadata terms. That list is hierarchical, and we can set it to basically show the path down the tree of where this term lives. So we've got the type ahead. If I didn't know exactly what the term was that I was looking for, I can press the icon to the right to see the overall list. And that's my hierarchy. I can just use this to select. What I've done is kind of made this field a folksonomy field where the end users are allowed to add items in. And we've got this link appear up here, this add new item link. If I press that, the end user can then add a new tag into the term store, which any content author then can then make use of. Now, I don't think you'd turn that on for all of your fields. You'll probably end up in a fairly quick metadata mess if you add it to every field and you've got lots of content authors. But I think that the way companies probably are going to use this is they'll have some fields which are closed, and that's just using the term set that's defined in, centrally. And then maybe you've got one field somewhere that you do allow content authors to tag themselves and add new content tags in. Often I see search solutions that use those things where they do take notice of the end user folksonomy field, but it's weighted lower down than the kind of more official fixed tag list. So there's a few things that you can do there in tagging, and I think that you can build lots of great solutions with that. Mm-hmm. It isn't permissions based, no. So if you've opened the field up, so the question was, is that permissions based? Could we allow some users to add items into the term set and others not? I'm pretty sure it isn't. Once you've opened it up, you've said that anybody that is a content author that has permissions to edit this item can add items into it. It's an interesting point, though. I can see how you might want that. Okay, so if I'm back on the page, okay, now we'll switch to the plain site because I need to edit web part properties. Let's just insert another web part here. In fact, no. What we'll do is instead of adding a web part, we will just show embedding video into the page content area. Notice on the ribbon I've got this video and audio. I would do if I didn't just accidentally press tab. Okay, so I'm in there, insert video. And what that's done is it's actually dropped a microphone gone? Ah, yeah, we're back on. Thank you. If I close this one down there, then edit the properties of this one, you can see that it's pretty easy for authors to add video to existing pages without needing some special control or some special zone on the page. So if I go to change media up here, I can pick the item out. In fact, one thing we'll show that is quite interesting is, let's say that the item doesn't exist in SharePoint yet. What you can do is you can kind of upload things in one slick move. So you can upload it to SharePoint and add it to the page. So this is something that the authors often complained about, that it was a two-step process to upload something to SharePoint, like an image or a video or anything like that, and then make use of it. What you can do is kind of do it in one fell swoop now, because the experience is a bit slicker. Then I can save and close that page. I didn't set it to run automatically, unfortunately, but there's your video kind of in the page. It didn't have a custom control or anything like that. It just kind of worked automatically. Okay, so those are the main improvements. I think think we've talked about the platform stuff, we've talked about the improvements, and we've talked about what's new. So I think that's it. If you've got any questions on WCM, I'll be happy to try and answer them. Yep.
You mentioned the site workflows.
Yeah.
Do you know what event does that look into? Or site creation? How do you what is it actually firing from?
Yep, there is a new event, which is when a site or web is created, and that's kind of got the same workflow auto start receiver on it. So that's how the workflow will start automatically when a site gets created.
And can you use it as a normal event receptor like on the list as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are new events in, I mean, that's down in sort of SharePoint Foundation level. So that's everywhere, yeah. Other questions? Yep.
What's their view of the new top bar of the ribbon?
Nothing. So anonymous users do not see the ribbon. The ribbon is purely about contributing to the site. So unless you kind of done something a bit wrong in your master page, I'm pretty sure that you shouldn't see any of the ribbon.
So on your the demo one you just showed us, is that authenticated?
Yes.
So what was the view there when you don't log in?
Let's try and see if we can do that. So do you mean on the orange site, the AdventureWorks site, or the out-of-the-box one? Okay. You mean you don't like Microsoft design for the out-of-the-box one? Okay, so if I save this, let's try and log out. Okay, so that closed the browser. Let's open it up again. I might not have anonymous access allowed on this site at the moment. If I think I have on this actually. Let me try and sign out here. You'll hopefully get an idea anyway. It's authenticating me again. It's keeping me authenticated for some reason, but I have tested this, and if you are not authenticated, then you don't get any of the ribbon. Would you want to see something of the ribbon for anonymous?
Not the ribbon, you just get sort of the idea that there's a ribbon there. It's not a placeholder. You're still showing some of the CSS.
So do you mean?
If you're not authenticated, you still sort of see 10 pixel wide blue strip at the top.
Okay. You might be right. I haven't noticed that. I mean, I have logged in as anonymous users. Sorry, oxymoron there. I have looked at sites in anonymous mode. I didn't notice anything. I take your word for it. But you know, lots of the CSS and JavaScript isn't being downloaded to the client when they're anonymous. So I know that they're not getting big chunks of ribbon. That's all I can say, I'm afraid. Right. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for your time.